5 best openings for this year for black. Enjoy. Coming in number 5 is the counter to the queen's pawn move, pawn to d4. And there we have the England Gambit, a tricky sub-variation of the England Gambit, which brings you the 54% win rate, but there is a really cool part about it. In the Lichess database, I've sorted the games played from January of 2023 only so that we know what works currently right now. And as we play pawn to e5, we can see that the top choice of white, the most played move by far, is to accept the gambit pawn. Then we go bishop c5, and the top move of white is knight to f3. Now we continue with pawn to d6. White is happily trading off their doubled pawn from e5, once again the most common move. Now as you play knight to e7, baiting white to accept one more gambit piece. In most cases, white does capture it, so we can see that we follow along the most played line, and white does fall for the trap. After this, you can shock white with bishop takes f2, deflecting the king from defense of the queen. So the queen has to move, the king has to move, and after that we pick up the queen, we win material, we attack here a bunch of pieces, the king is exposed, and you get a winning position. And here are the 2 pro tips. One is after you enter this variation d6, in this case, right after your opponent plays pawn takes d6, you want to play knight to e7 right away, so that your opponent can think that you pre-moved this move up front, and so that after he captured it, computer automatically played the move knight e7. Your opponent will be happy, will happily grab your knight, and will fall for the trap after bishop takes f2. So that's the pro tip number 1. And the pro tip number 2, not many players know that you can actually bait white in various different ways here. You can actually play something like knight to c6 or bishop g4, virtually any normal move, and after that white will still be tempted to take on c7, because if not, you're gonna pick up this move yourself on the next move by the bishop and your position will be more or less fine. And if white captures this pawn on c7, that fails to the same tactics, bishop takes f2 followed by queen takes d1, and our bishop, by the way, controls this square, therefore he can't promote a new queen, and you get a winning position. Coming in number 4 is a counter to the most common king's pawn move, and as we enter the main line, here white usually goes for the attack of your f7 pawn, hoping for the fried liver attack, and here comes the Trackster counter attack. I know that lots of you guys enjoy this variation, and for a good reason. In the main line after knight takes f7, black gets a whopping 57% win rate. Now, just a quick thing. The correct move for white is actually bishop takes f7, but even after that the position remains to be tricky and it's not easy for white to figure out the right way after that. But in most cases your opponents are going to play knight takes f7 because it looks like they're forking your half of pieces and they're just winning the game, and then you shock them with a counter blow, bishop takes f2. Once again, the proper move for white is a counterintuitive king to f1, and again the position remains to be complicated. But in most cases your opponents are going to grab the bishop because that's the most natural thing to do, then you play knight takes c4, yet another counter-attacking move, and after the king moves somewhere, it doesn't really matter, it can go to, a bunch of different squares, but in pretty much every case you're going to follow up with queen to h4, and then not only you remove your queen from danger so that it can't be captured anymore, but you actually create a counter threat of queen to f2, checkmating 1. And it's definitely not easy for white to counter it, given the fact that the f-file is open and you always have an idea to put your rook there and to continue the attack, plus your other knight from c6 is always ready to go forward and to attack a bunch of squares in white's position, which also makes it easy for white to blunder something. For instance, right now, as you threaten this queen takes queen to f2 checkmate, if they play g3, you can actually just take on g3, that would be good enough, or queen f6, reroute the queen to attack white king from the other angle, and after that you continue with queen f2 check, king h3, and here comes a surprising move d5, opening up this check from the bishop, and white is basically done. For instance, after g4, trying to cover the king, you can play h5, trying to open up this diagonal, and on the next move, white is actually defenseless, you've got a bunch of threats. For instance, after bishop takes d5, you can play pawn takes g4, and it's a fancy double check, and a discovered check, and a checkmate as well. Of course, white could play differently, but the line just goes to show how hard it is for white to figure out the right way, and how one subtle error can lead white to a complete devastation. Coming in number 3 is a more solid counter to the white's queen's pawn move, pawn to d4. In this case, we still initially gambit the pawn with the move pawn to e5, but after they recapture, you can play pawn to d6, which is a so-called Charlie gambit. Now, the previous line we analyzed, if you remember, bishop c5 followed by pawn to d6, was a more tricky way. We just relied on our opponent to not know the trap and to fall for it. But with the move pawn to d6, we don't just rely on a single trap. Rather, we want to have advantage in activity, quick development, and good long-term initiative. And that's why it's one of my favorite openings, especially for Blitz, and it's definitely not easy for white to handle it. Now, in most cases, they're going to play knight f3 and knight c3 in whatever order. And what you got to know here is that in this variation, we do want to castle queenside. And for that reason, we do want to develop these queenside pieces first. So that's a difference. We do not want to play standard moves, knight f6 and castle queenside. That's not the point. We want to develop the queenside pieces. And therefore, in pretty much every case, we're going to go knight to c6, bishop g4, queen e7. We methodically develop queenside pieces, getting ready to castle queenside. So for example, we go knight to c6, white develops, you go bishop g4. As soon as you put your bishop right here, your opponents will usually play e3 to provide some protection to this knight. Then we play queen e7, and on the next move we castle queenside. And if you follow the correct play, your win rate will be 60% or even higher. The trick is, you just have this nice position with lots of open files and diagonals for your rook, for your bishops. You put pressure, and although Stockfish might be able to defend this position for white, for human being it's just a much harder task for you to execute. You just develop, you push the h move forward, and white is always under pressure of your attack. Quite often your opponents will lightheartedly castle kingside and actually blunder their queen right away, because now you can make use of the opposition of your queen and the rook. You can first trade off this knight and then play bishop takes h2, which is a discovered attack of the queen. Thus you grab the queen on the next move and you continue attacking their exposed king, which is nice. Even if they don't blunder the queen that way, you still have a nice attacking position. The second most effective opening for 2024 is our rebellion opening counter to the Italian game, is the Russo Gambit pawn f5. In most cases, your opponents are going to see this threat, are going to capture on f5, and after e4, that gives you the winning rate of 61%, which is quite impressive. Now, what I really love about this opening is that all natural moves of your opponent are wrong. So they got to play really counterintuitive moves in order to take advantage of their position. But right now, they're already somewhat in trouble. This knight is attacked, you take away all the squares where this knight could possibly go to, and in most cases, they're going to play some silly moves. One of them would be bishop takes g8. Some of your opponents incorrectly assume that this trade on g8 is good for them because you won't be able to castle after that. And although it's true, a more important factor of the position is just the fact that this bishop on c4 is one of the very few pieces that they have developed, and therefore as they trade it off, they basically have no active pieces in the game, plus this knight is still attacked. Now it has to go back, and you can see that white is now completely passive and have a perfect setup for the next game, so it's quite reasonable already. Now they have a little hope for queen h5 check, and although you could stop it easily, I would recommend that you allow them to play it, because that would be another move in the wrong direction. So you just play pawn to d5, and now if they play queen h5, and in most cases they will, that would be another wrong step. So they ignore development, which can be good, but they're still hoping for this attack, and they're still having the false impression that you're playing some dubious, weird moves, and they want to punish you for that. You go pawn g6. And it turns out that your rook is quite handy here on g file, right? It's going to support your future attack there. For instance, after an exchange, now this rook is doing a good job there actually. But your opponent will probably grab this pawn, hoping for some sort of attack. You play queen g5, which not only covers your rook, but also threatens queen takes g2, and from there we're going to attack their rook on h1, and actually white is done. For instance, they play pawn g3, now it turns out that this queen that's been wasted so much time is actually trapped after rook to h6. The only move for the queen to go to would be to capture this pawn, but after bishop d6, there is no way to run away, and you win the queen, and you have a much better and superior position overall anyway, so it's completely winning for black. The highest win rate opening for black is another counter to the Italian game, and particularly to the attempt of the fried liver attack. In this case, we're playing the shameless, ruthless knight takes e4 move, which comes as a complete shocker for the vast majority of your opponents. Instead of trying to defend this pawn, we just give up a knight, which looks like complete madness. But in fact, it's a really tricky opening with lots of opportunities for you to win the game within the next couple moves. In fact, I just checked the database, and from over 1 million games that was played in this line, in 98.3% of the cases, white were unable to find the correct reaction. And therefore, even though there is a subtle risk that your opponent knows the right counter, the risk is really slim, and it's worth taking the risk and trying it out. So what's the point? The two most common moves of white are either knight takes f7 or knight takes e4, and both of them are wrong. And even if they play the correct move bishop takes f7, after that they still usually follow up with the wrong moves, still getting into a bad position. So in most cases they're going to take knight takes f7 thinking that this fork wins the game right away. But you play queen h4 countering their opponent f2, which is somewhat similar to the trackstar counterattack which we talked about previously. And strangely enough, it's really not easy for white to defend this position, especially given the fact that you can easily also include your bishop into this attack. You can also jump forward with your knight and take control over a bunch of squares into his territory, and it's really not easy for white to deal with this threat. For example, if they try g3, which looks like it just shuts down black right away, all of a sudden you sack your knight over here with a bunch of different threats. First off, their h-pawn is pinned down to the rook, so they can't recapture with that pawn. Plus you threaten this bishop, the knight on f7 is also somewhat hanging, queen e4 check is also coming. There are really a lot of threats and white is lost. For example, if they decide to just grab your rook and think, okay, that's just an exchange, rook for rook, instead you just play queen e4 and you force your opponent into give up chess. Because it's check to the king, and our knight is doing a good job controlling these two squares as well, so he can't really defend. He's got to play bishop e2, giving up the rook in the corner, and after that, in order to cover the king, they'll have to give up the bishop, but it still doesn't help because you grab the bishop and push them all the way into checkers.